Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham, often remains overshadowed by his more famous half-brother Isaac, yet his story carries profound lessons about faith, rejection, and divine grace. Born under complex circumstances, Ishmael's life reflects the tension between human attempts to fulfill God's promises and God's own sovereign plan. Abraham, promised by God to be the father of many nations, initially doubted how that promise could be fulfilled when his wife Sarah remained barren for years. In a moment of desperation, Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with Hagar, her maidservant, and thus Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86 years old. Though Ishmael was loved by his father, his very existence created a deep divide within Abraham's family, especially when Sarah, upon miraculously bearing Isaac, saw Ishmael as a threat to her son's inheritance. Despite being the firstborn, Ishmael was not the child of the covenant. God had promised that Sarah would bear a son, and Isaac would inherit the blessings meant for Abraham. The tension reached its peak when Sarah demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out, and though it grieved Abraham, God instructed him to listen to Sarah, promising that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation in his own right. Even though Ishmael's life seemed marked by rejection and hardship, God's grace was evident. In the wilderness, when Hagar feared for their lives, God intervened and provided water, ensuring Ishmael's survival and future. Ishmael would go on to father 12 tribes, and his descendants would become a significant and influential people. Yet, Ishmael's story isn't just a tale of survival. It serves as a powerful metaphor for the dynamics of faith and promise. While Isaac represents the fulfillment of God's supernatural promises through divine intervention, Ishmael embodies the results of human effort, an attempt to achieve God's will through worldly means. Ishmael's life reminds us of God's sovereignty, his ability to bless even those outside the direct path of promise, and the ways in which he fulfills his purposes despite human failings. His story teaches us that even when we feel overlooked or rejected, God's plans for our lives remain intact, and his grace is sufficient. Sarah and Abraham are two of the most pivotal figures in the Bible, embodying faith, obedience, and the complexity of human relationships with God. Originally named Sarai and Abram, they were both descendants of the line of Shem, and God chose them to be the ancestors of a great nation. Despite their advanced age and Sarah's barrenness, God made a profound promise to Abraham that he would become the father of many nations. However, Sarah, who had been unable to conceive, struggled to reconcile God's promise with their reality. The weight of her infertility led her to take matters into her own hands, as she offered her maidservant Hagar to Abraham in an attempt to fulfill God's promise through human effort rather than trusting in divine timing. Sarah's decision, though understandable in the context of her longing for children, created a complicated situation. Hagar bore Abraham's first son, Ishmael, yet the birth of this child did not resolve Sarah's inner turmoil, but instead deepened the conflict within the family. Tensions between Sarah and Hagar grew, particularly when Hagar, upon becoming pregnant, began to look down upon Sarah, who remained childless. This tension ultimately led to Sarah's decision to expel Hagar and Ishmael from their household, a decision that was not easy for Abraham, but one that was ultimately guided by God's will. Despite these struggles, Sarah's story is also one of redemption. God remained faithful to his promise, and at the age of 90, Sarah miraculously gave birth to Isaac, the child through whom God's covenant with Abraham would be fulfilled. Sarah's journey teaches us about waiting on God's promises, even in times of uncertainty, and trusting that his timing and plans are far greater than our own. Through Sarah and Abraham, we see that faith does not mean an absence of struggle, but rather an unwavering belief in God's ability to work through our imperfections. Ishmael's story begins with the deep longing and frustration of his mother, Hagar, and the complex relationship between his parents, Abraham and Sarah. When God promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, both Abraham and Sarah faced the challenge of Sarah's barrenness. As time passed and Sarah remained childless, she grew impatient with God's promise and, in her desperation, suggested that Abraham have a child with Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant. In that era, it was customary for a barren wife to offer a servant to her husband in hopes of having children through her. Abraham, though reluctant, agreed, and Hagar conceived, giving birth to Ishmael when Abraham was 86 years old. While Ishmael's birth brought joy to Abraham, it also introduced tension and discord within the family. Hagar, upon realizing she was pregnant, began to despise Sarah, who was still without a child. This created a rift as Sarah's jealousy and insecurity grew, and she mistreated Hagar. Feeling oppressed, Hagar fled into the wilderness, where she encountered an angel of the Lord who comforted her and instructed her to return to Sarah and Abraham. The angel also told Hagar that her son would be called Ishmael, meaning God hears, for the Lord had heard her distress. Despite Ishmael's birth not being the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, God still declared that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. In time, Ishmael grew into a young man, and though tensions persisted between him and Isaac after his birth, Ishmael would eventually father 12 sons, forming tribes that became the ancestors of the Arab peoples. Ishmael's birth, though born of human effort, was not overlooked by God. His life is a reminder that even in our failures or impatience, God's purposes are still at work, shaping destinies far beyond what we can see. The tension between Sarah and Hagar became increasingly palpable after the birth of Ishmael. While Sarah had initially suggested that Abraham take Hagar as a wife in order to bear a child, the reality of this arrangement soon proved to be far more complicated than anticipated. Hagar's pregnancy brought her a sense of superiority, and she began to look down on Sarah, who remained childless. This shift in power dynamics fueled Sarah's frustration and jealousy. As Hagar's attitude became more contemptuous, Sarah's distress deepened, and she turned to Abraham for help. Sarah, feeling humiliated and threatened, confronted Abraham, accusing him of causing the discord. In response, Abraham, reluctant to take sides, allowed Sarah to handle the situation as she saw fit. Sarah's growing resentment led her to demand that Abraham cast out Hagar and her son, Ishmael. She could no longer tolerate the presence of the child who, though not born of her, seemed to overshadow Isaac's rightful place in the family. This request was a deeply painful one for Abraham, as Ishmael was his son, and he loved him dearly. However, God spoke to Abraham, assuring him that while Isaac would be the child of the covenant, he would also make a great nation out of Ishmael. Abraham was instructed to listen to Sarah, and despite the pain it caused him, he reluctantly sent Hagar and Ishmael away. The situation was not just a personal dispute, it symbolized the broader tensions of human striving versus divine promise. Sarah's decision to expel Hagar and Ishmael was born out of fear and insecurity, but God's intervention revealed a greater plan. Though Hagar and Ishmael were sent into the wilderness, God did not abandon them, showing that his promises extend beyond human understanding and limitations, even to those who might seem forgotten or rejected. After Sarah's demand to send Hagar and Ishmael away, the two were cast into the wilderness with little more than a loaf of bread and a skin of water. Abraham's heart was heavy as he watched them leave, but God assured him that Ishmael would also be blessed, as he was Abraham's son. As they wandered through the harsh desert, Hagar and Ishmael soon found themselves in a dire situation. The water they had been given ran out, and the scorching heat of the wilderness drained them both. In despair, Hagar placed her son under a shrub, unable to bear the thought of watching him die from thirst. She sat at a distance, weeping bitterly, feeling utterly abandoned and hopeless. But God had not forgotten them. In their moment of deepest need, the Lord heard Ishmael's cries. An angel of God called out to Hagar from heaven, comforting her with the promise that God had heard the voice of the boy. The angel directed Hagar to lift Ishmael up and assured her that God would provide for them. Then, miraculously, Hagar saw a well of water spring up from the ground, offering life-saving refreshment to both her and her son. God's protection and provision were evident in that moment, as he had promised that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation. This divine intervention was not just about physical survival, it was a declaration of God's faithfulness to his word. Though Ishmael was not the child of the covenant, God still had a plan for his life. He assured Hagar that Ishmael would grow into a strong and independent man, and his descendants would become a great nation. God's grace extended beyond the borders of the covenant, showing that his mercy reaches all who call upon him, even in the most hopeless of situations. Ishmael's life, though marked by early struggles, would eventually lead to the formation of a great and prosperous lineage. As promised by God, Ishmael fathered 12 sons, each of whom became the leader of their own tribe. These tribes, known as the Ishmaelites, settled in the wilderness regions that stretched from Egypt to Assyria, marking the beginning of a distinct and powerful people group. The names of Ishmael's sons, Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema are recorded in Genesis 25 verses 13 to 16. These names reflect a diverse and growing people who would come to be known as the ancestors of the Arab nations. The Ishmaelites were traditionally nomadic, living in movable camps, and their culture was shaped by their environment, deeply rooted in the desert wilderness. Though Ishmael's descendants would thrive and grow into a mighty nation, the relationship between Ishmael and Isaac remained distant. Despite God's promise to bless Ishmael and his descendants, Isaac was still the child of the covenant, chosen to carry forward God's specific promises to Abraham. The Bible does not indicate any direct conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, but it is clear that their lives were shaped by the contrasting roles they held. Isaac was the son of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and the one through whom God's covenant with Abraham would be fulfilled. Ishmael, on the other hand, was the son of Hagar, a maidservant, born out of human effort and impatience. While Isaac inherited the promises of the covenant, Ishmael's line would become a people known for their strength and endurance, but outside the direct line of God's chosen promise. Over time, Ishmael and Isaac's paths likely diverged further, with their respective tribes establishing different destinies. Ishmael's descendants, though often in conflict with the Israelites, were still part of God's broader plan, as God had promised to bless them as well. In a deeper sense, the division between Isaac and Ishmael represents a spiritual distinction between the promise of God's grace and the attempt to achieve blessings through human effort. Yet, God's faithfulness to Ishmael shows that his mercy and plans extend beyond our understanding, reaching even those outside the immediate covenant. The story of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael is rich with lessons about decision-making, patience, and trust in God's plan. Each character's actions reflect both the struggles and triumphs of living in accordance with divine will, and their choices serve as reminders for us in our own lives. Abraham, despite his faith in God's promises, often faltered when faced with uncertainty. His decision to father a child with Hagar, prompted by Sarah's impatience, demonstrates the human tendency to take matters into our own hands when God's timing seems too slow. This choice led to conflict and hardship, showing that acting outside of God's perfect plan can result in consequences that last for generations. Sarah's role in this narrative highlights the dangers of impatience and doubt. Despite God's promise, she struggled to trust that he would provide his son through her, leading her to offer Hagar as a surrogate. Sarah's decision to interfere with God's plan caused division and heartache, not just for herself, but for others as well. Her story teaches us that God's promises are not bound by our timetables and that trusting in his timing is essential to avoid unnecessary pain. Hagar's experience offers a powerful lesson in resilience and faith amidst hardship. Cast aside by Sarah, she found herself in a desolate wilderness with her son. Yet, even in her despair, God showed her compassion and promised to protect and bless Ishmael. Hagar's story reminds us that, even when we feel abandoned or overlooked, God sees us and has a plan for our lives, even if it's not what we initially expected. Finally, Ishmael's life is a testament to the power of God's grace. Despite being the product of human impatience, God still honored his promise to Abraham and made Ishmael the father of a great nation. This illustrates that God's purposes are not thwarted by our mistakes, but are often fulfilled in ways beyond our understanding. The choices of these characters challenge us to reflect on how we make decisions, exercise patience, and trust God's plan, knowing that his way is always the best way. The story of Ishmael, Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar is much more than an ancient biblical narrative. It is a reflection of the choices we all face in life, highlighting the importance of patience, trust, and the need to align our decisions with God's divine plan. At the heart of this story lies the struggle between human effort and divine timing, a tension that resonates deeply with our own lives. By examining the choices made by these biblical figures, we can draw valuable lessons that speak to our own struggles with impatience, faith, and surrender. Abraham's story is one of profound faith, but also one of human weakness. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, yet when that promise seemed delayed, Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands. By fathering a child with Hagar, Abraham sought to fulfill God's promise through human effort, rather than waiting on God's perfect timing. This decision, while understandable given their old age and apparent barrenness, led to long-lasting consequences. The conflict between Ishmael and Isaac and the resulting tension between Sarah and Hagar remind us that when we act outside of God's timing, we often create problems that are beyond our control. Abraham's life teaches us that while faith is essential, trusting in God's timing is just as important. Sarah's actions reflected deep internal struggle. On one hand, she believed in God's promise, but on the other, she doubted God's ability to fulfill it through her. Her impatience led her to make the difficult decision to give Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate, believing this would fulfill God's promise. But this act of control and manipulation led to resentment, jealousy, and division within the family. Sarah's story serves as a powerful reminder that when we doubt God's plan or try to rush his timing, we often bring unnecessary pain into our lives. It teaches us that true faith involves not just believing in God's promises, but also trusting that he knows the best time for everything. Hagar's story, on the other hand, is a beautiful testament to God's compassion and grace, even in the most challenging circumstances. As a slave and an outsider, Hagar had little power in this story. After Sarah's harsh treatment, she was cast out into the wilderness with her son, Ishmael. Yet it was in the wilderness, a place of despair and isolation, that God met Hagar. He saw her distress and promised to make Ishmael the father of a great nation. Hagar's experience teaches us that even in our moments of abandonment or despair, God sees us. He has a plan for us, and even when we feel discarded or insignificant, his promises remain true. God's intervention in Hagar's life reminds us that his grace is sufficient. Ishmael's life also offers profound lessons, especially regarding God's sovereignty and grace. While Ishmael was not the son of the covenant, God still made a promise to him, ensuring that he would father a great nation. This reminds us that God's plans often unfold in ways we do not understand. His grace is not limited by our human understanding of what is deserved or earned. Ishmael, despite his origins, became the father of 12 tribes, a powerful testimony to God's ability to bring forth greatness from unlikely places. His story shows that God's purposes cannot be thwarted by human mistakes, and that he can still use us to fulfill his grand design, even when we fall short. In our own lives, we often face moments when we feel tempted to take control of situations, to rush God's plan, or to doubt his ability to fulfill his promises. We may struggle with impatience, or we may question whether God's timing is truly the best. Yet, the lives of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael remind us that the path to God's blessings is not through our own efforts or manipulation, but through trust, patience, and surrender to his will. We must recognize that God's timing is perfect, even when it feels delayed. And just as he was faithful to Abraham, he will be faithful to us, fulfilling his promises in ways that may surprise us, but will always be for our ultimate good. As we reflect on these lessons, let us remember that trusting in God requires patience, but it also demands an unwavering belief that his plan is always greater than our own. Let us not be like Sarah and Abraham, who took matters into their own hands, but instead, let us rest in God's sovereignty. Let us be like Hagar, who found grace and compassion in her lowest moments, and like Ishmael, whose life shows that God's grace extends beyond our understanding. If you found inspiration in the story and its life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll continue to receive powerful stories and insights from the Bible that can guide and encourage you in your journey of faith. Stay connected and let these stories of faith, patience, and trust illuminate your path.